The story most people know begins with certainty. It opens with movement, with arrival, with tall figures stepping down from the sky as if the world itself had been waiting only for them. There is confidence in that beginning, a sense of order, a feeling that everything important starts exactly where the story tells you it does, and that confidence is comforting. A beginning like that asks very little of the listener. It gives you a clear starting line. It gives you power, intention, direction. Gods arrive, history begins. Meaning follows neatly behind. Nothing feels missing. But sometimes, when a story feels too complete, it is worth pausing. Not to argue with it, not to reject it, just to sit with it for a moment longer than usual. Because certainty has a texture, and this one feels strangely smooth. Tonight, instead of rushing forward, we slow down. We listen not for what is said loudly, but for what never quite gets mentioned. The earliest versions of this story feel confident in a way that ancient voices rarely do. They speak with authority, with clarity, with an assurance that feels polished, almost finished. And that raises a quiet question. If this really were the beginning, why does it sound like it already knows how the story ends? Ancient texts, especially the oldest ones, rarely speak this way. They hesitate. They circle ideas. They leave gaps where certainty has not yet formed. They are careful, sometimes frustratingly so, because the people who wrote them were describing a world they did not fully understand yet. But the beginning we are usually given about the Anunnaki does not hesitate at all. It arrives fully formed. Tall beings, advanced knowledge, authority from above. It feels less like a memory being uncovered, and more like a conclusion being placed at the front. And that is where something begins to feel slightly off, not wrong, just positioned. Because where you place a beginning matters more than most people realize. The starting point silently decides who becomes powerful, who becomes secondary, and what gets remembered at all. When a story starts late, everything before it fades into irrelevance. Not because it did not exist, but because no one was invited to look there. The Anunnaki placed at the very front become creators by default, rulers by implication, masters not because the tablets demand it, but because our minds do. And the mind is very good at filling gaps. Tonight is not about denying their presence. The Anunnaki do appear in the texts. That is not the question. The question is quieter than that. Where do they appear? Because when the oldest Sumerian tablets are read carefully, slowly, without the pressure to entertain or impress, something unexpected happens. The dramatic opening we are used to disappears. There is no grand arrival scene, no opening command, no moment where the world suddenly begins. Instead, there is a pause, a long one. The tablets do not rush, they do not explain, they do not announce. They begin in a way that feels uncomfortable to modern ears, because modern stories are trained to avoid this exact thing. They begin without action, without intention, without authority. They begin in a state that does not feel like a beginning at all. And this is usually where retellings step in and help the story along. They fill the silence. They move events forward. They give faces to what has none, because silence is difficult to sell. It asks for patience. It asks the listener to stay present without reward. So the silence gets edited out, quietly, over time. What replaces it is a louder opening, one that feels more exciting, more memorable, more complete. A beginning where gods arrive and history finally starts moving. But when we return to the tablets themselves, when we resist the urge to help them along, that opening does not exist. What exists instead is waiting, not emptiness, not chaos, waiting. A world that has not decided what it will become yet. This matters more than it seems, because beginnings shape meaning. When you place gods at the start, everything else bends around them. Humanity becomes secondary. Nature becomes material. Balance becomes something to be controlled instead of something that already exists. And slowly, without anyone intending it, the story shifts. Not through deception, but through placement. A louder beginning replaces a quieter one. A confident story replaces an uncertain memory. And once that happens enough times, the confident version starts to feel ancient, even if it is not. The tablets themselves never argue. They never correct us. They simply remain, cracked and incomplete, waiting for someone willing to read them without rushing. This is where we are standing now, at the edge of a beginning that feels too neat. Before any gods act, before any commands are spoken, before power has learnt how to move, there is a space here that most retellings step around. A space that does not offer drama or authority, only presence. A space that feels unfinished, because it is. And unfinished stories make us uneasy. They do not tell us what to think. They do not explain themselves. They ask us to slow down, to stay with uncertainty a little longer than is comfortable. So before we go any further, we do not replace one myth with another. We do not tear anything down. We simply move the starting line back, quietly, step by step, into the place where the story does not yet know what it is about to become. Because if the beginning we were given feels too confident, too clear, too sure of itself, it may not be ancient truth. It may be a modern echo placed at the front because silence is harder to sit with. And in the silence before the Anunnaki arrive, something else is already there. Not action, not power, just a world that exists and waits. Once you notice the confidence of the familiar beginning, it becomes difficult to ignore. The story no longer feels ancient in the way cracked clay and broken lines usually do. It feels assembled, clean, as if someone decided where it should start and never looked back. So instead of asking what happens next, we ask a different question. What happens before this? Not before the Anunnaki act, before they arrive, before they are named at all. When scholars return to the oldest Sumerian tablets and resist the urge to organize them into a smooth narrative, something subtle begins to emerge. The texts do not open with authority. They do not begin with instruction or creation. They begin in a way that feels almost hesitant, as if the scribes themselves were unsure how to describe what came first. There is no clear opening scene, no announcement, no moment where history confidently steps onto the stage. Instead, there is a sense of delay, a feeling that the story is already in progress, even though nothing has happened yet. This is uncomfortable for modern readers because we expect beginnings to explain themselves. We want context, motivation, cause. The tablets offer none of that. They simply exist at a point where action has not yet begun. And when later retellings place the Anunnaki at the front, they solve a problem the tablets never tried to solve. They give us something to hold on to, a figure, a name, a source of direction. But in doing so, they quietly erase something more fragile and more honest. The gap, that gap is not empty. It is full of restraint. The earliest lines do not describe gods shaping the world. They do not describe humanity being created or commanded. They do not describe power moving from one place to another. What they describe instead is a condition, a state of being that does not yet act. This is why the story feels strange when you slow down enough to hear it. Nothing is happening, and yet nothing is missing. The world is present, but not directed. It has not chosen sides. It has not separated itself into roles. There is no above and below in the way we understand it. No hierarchy waiting to be filled. Only existence without urgency. Modern narratives struggle with this kind of beginning because it offers no drama. It does not reward attention quickly. It does not reassure the listener that something important is about to happen, so the starting line gets moved. Quietly at first. The silence becomes absence. The waiting becomes nothingness. And once it is labeled as nothing, it can be safely skipped. But the tablets never call it nothing. They describe a world that is unfinished, not broken. A world that has not yet learned how to act. And that distinction matters, because unfinished things behave very differently from empty ones. An empty space invites control. An unfinished space demands patience. The scribes who carved these lines were not trying to impress. They were recording something that did not fit neatly into language yet. And instead of forcing clarity where none existed, they left room. That room is where most modern versions of the story become uncomfortable, because room invites questions, and questions weaken certainty. So later narratives compress the beginning. They skip forward to the moment when names appear, when figures can be described, when actions can be followed. The Anunnaki become the first clear shapes in the story, not because they were first, but because they were easier to describe, easier to remember, easier to repeat. But ease is not the same as accuracy. When we move the starting line backward, the role of the Anunnaki begins to change. They are no longer creators emerging from nothing. They are participants entering an already existing condition, a world that does not need to be started, only changed. And that shift is subtle but profound. Because once you accept that the world existed before intention, power loses its claim to origin. Authority becomes something that arises later, not something woven into reality from the beginning. The tablets hint at this gently. They do not announce it. They let it be felt. A long stillness, a presence without command. A reality that does not rush to define itself. This is where the story actually begins, even if it does not feel like a beginning at all. And this is why so many retellings avoid it. Silence does not perform well. It does not demand belief. It does not reward loyalty. It simply waits. As we continue moving backward, further away from names and roles, the world becomes softer, less divided, harder to describe, and yet, paradoxically, it feels older, more authentic, less shaped by later ideas about control and purpose. We are not stepping into chaos. We are stepping into restraint, into a time before direction felt necessary, before action felt urgent, before power had learned to speak. And somewhere inside that quiet space, the story is already alive, even though it has not yet learned how to move. The Anunnaki will appear later. The tablets are clear about that. But first, there is something else. A world that does not begin with arrival, but with waiting. When the starting line continues to move backward, the story begins to lose its familiar edges. Names fade first, then roles. Then intention itself softens until what remains no longer behaves like a narrative at all. It feels more like a condition. The oldest Sumerian texts do not describe a moment of creation in this early layer. There is no let there be, no decision that splits time into before and after. Instead, they gesture toward a state where nothing has yet decided to act. A world that exists, but does not move forward. This is difficult to imagine, because modern thinking is built around purpose. We expect things to do something, to head somewhere, to respond to commands or desires. But here, none of that has taken shape yet. There is no command because there is no need for one. No authority because nothing resists. No conflict because nothing stands apart. The tablets speak carefully here, almost indirectly, as if language itself is struggling to remain gentle enough. They do not describe emptiness. They describe fullness without separation. Everything that will later become distinct is still resting together, undivided, unchanged. This is not chaos. Chaos implies collision, disorder, movement without direction, but movement itself has not arrived yet. What the texts suggest is something quieter than chaos and older than order, a state where existence is complete but not defined. It is tempting to label this as nothingness, because nothingness feels familiar, but the tablets do not treat it that way. They treat it as presence without shape, a kind of stillness that holds everything, precisely because it has not chosen anything yet. This is why the language leans toward sensation instead of action, toward feeling instead of command. Words like waiting, resting, holding, not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening cannot be rushed. Time here does not behave the way we expect. There is no urgency pushing the world forward, no sense that something must occur next. The world does not feel unfinished because it lacks something. It feels unfinished because it has not yet learned to separate itself. And separation, as the tablets will later show, is the true beginning of history. Before that moment, there is no above and below, no hierarchy waiting to form, no position that feels higher or lower than another. Everything shares the same depth, the same presence, the same silence. This is why later readers struggle with this section of the story. There is no anchor, no figure to follow, no event to point to and say, this is where it starts. The world simply exists, and that existence does not explain itself, but this lack of explanation is not a flaw, it is a clue. It tells us that the earliest scribes were not inventing drama, they were recording a memory of stillness, a time before memory needed to organize itself, a time before meaning had learned how to arrange events into stories. In this state, nothing wants to rule. Nothing wants to arrive. Nothing wants to change the world because the world does not yet experience itself as something that can be changed. It is whole, not because it is perfect, but because it is undivided. And this wholeness is fragile, not because it is weak, but because it cannot last once awareness begins to form. The moment difference is felt, even faintly, the world will no longer be able to remain this still. But that moment has not arrived yet. For now, everything remains connected, not mixed or confused, but unified. The tablets do not describe boundaries because boundaries have not been learned. They do not describe direction because direction has no meaning yet. Modern retellings often rush past this layer, treating it as a poetic preface rather than the foundation itself. But this is where the tone of the entire story is set. Because if the world begins without intention, then intention is not sacred. If existence precedes command, then command is not absolute. Power, in this context, becomes something that appears later, not something woven into reality itself. And that idea is unsettling. It suggests that authority is a development, not a law of nature. That structure is learned, not given. That control emerges because something changes, not because it was always meant to be there. The world before action does not ask to be believed. It does not present rules or lessons. It simply waits, holding everything gently, without urgency. And in that waiting, something begins to shift, not yet as a decision, not yet as a command, just as a feeling. A subtle sense that balance, held too perfectly, cannot remain untouched forever. But for now, the world is still, and in that stillness, everything that will one day move is already present, simply resting unaware of what separation will soon require. When the tablets finally reach for an image to describe this early world, they do not choose stone or sky or light. They choose water. Not because water is dramatic, but because it is patient, because water can hold without deciding, because it remembers without organizing. This is where many modern readings quietly slip. Water is often treated as disorder, as something wild, something that must be shaped, divided, controlled. But in the oldest Sumerian language, water is not chaos, it is continuity. It is the closest metaphor they had for fullness without form. Water surrounds, water supports, water carries weight without choosing sides. The tablets describe an endless deep knot to frighten the listener, but to explain a condition where everything exists together without needing to be separated. There is no surface yet, no depth in the way we understand it, only presence layered upon presence. In water, nothing is forced to stand apart. This matters because language itself struggles here. Words divide, names separate, and this world has not been divided yet. So the scribes lean toward sensation instead of structure, toward images that flow rather than concepts that lock into place. Water becomes a way to remember what cannot be categorized. It holds light without keeping it. It moves without choosing a destination. It supports life without commanding it. This is not a destructive flood. There is nothing being washed away. There is no punishment or cleansing. Those ideas belong to much later stories, written by cultures already shaped by law, guilt, and authority. Here, water is simply there, a deep that does not rush, a presence that does not demand. The world, in this state, is not asleep. It is attentive in a different way. It does not act, but it allows. It does not choose, but it holds the possibility of every choice that will come later. And this is why later storytellers grow uncomfortable here. A world held by water cannot be ruled easily. It has no edges to defend, no borders to enforce, no fixed positions to claim authority over. Everything touches everything else. Everything shares the same depth. For systems built on hierarchy, this kind of beginning is dangerous, because it suggests that order is not natural, that control is not original, that balance existed long before anyone learned how to command it. The tablets never say this directly. They do not need to. They let the image speak. Water is memory, not in the sense of recorded events, but in the sense of continuity. It carries what has been without insisting on what must come next. It remembers without judgment. It flows round obstacles instead of breaking them. This is why water appears again and again in the earliest layers of human myth, across cultures that never spoke to each other. Not as a threat, but as a reminder of a time before division felt necessary. In this Sumerian context, the deep waters are not something to escape from. They are something everything will eventually rise out of, and what rises from them will always carry traces of that origin, whether it remembers it or not. The tablets treat this state with respect. They do not rush to leave it behind. They linger as if aware that once separation begins, this kind of wholeness will never fully return. Because once edges appear, water changes. It becomes rivers, seas, boundaries. It gains direction. It gains limits. It can be owned, blocked, redirected. But here, none of that exists yet. Water fills everything, not because it overwhelms, but because nothing has learned how to stand apart from it. There is no resistance, no pressure, no need for release. And yet, even in this fullness, something subtle begins to form. Not a plan, not a desire, a feeling. The kind that arises when stillness lasts long enough to become aware of itself. When balance, held perfectly, begins to sense that it cannot remain untouched forever. The tablets do not describe this as a flaw. They describe it as inevitability, because a world that holds everything without distinction also holds the conditions for distinction to emerge. Water does not oppose separation, it allows it. And this is where memory quietly becomes movement. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, as pressure begins to gather where nothing previously pressed. The deep still holds everything. But for the first time, it no longer holds everything in exactly the same way. And that difference, barely perceptible, is enough to change what comes next. Nothing announces the change when it begins. There is no signal, no command, no moment that can be pointed to and named. The tablets do not describe a decision being made. They describe a feeling settling in, a difference that cannot yet be explained. The deep waters still hold everything. The world still rests inside the same fullness. And yet, something no longer feels perfectly even, not broken, not divided, just uneven in a way that has never existed before. This is where modern storytelling often expects purpose to appear, a will, an intention, a plan, but the texts refuse that language. They do not describe anyone wanting something. They describe pressure. Pressure does not choose. Pressure does not plan. Pressure simply builds when closeness lasts too long. Everything that once rested together now begins to sense itself slightly differently. Some parts feel heavier, others feel lighter, not because anyone decided it should be so, but because perfect balance, held without movement, creates its own strain over time. The tablets slow down here, almost deliberately. They treat this moment with care, because once difference is felt, it cannot be unfelt. Awareness, even without intention, changes the state of the world. Before this, there was no direction. Now, direction begins to matter, not as a rule, but as a sensation. A faint pull, a subtle leaning. The first hint that not everything rests in the same way anymore. This is not conflict, it is awareness. And awareness is powerful precisely because it does not need to act to change things. The moment something is noticed, the world is no longer fully asleep. It has begun to listen to itself. The tablets do not assign blame here. They do not suggest error or failure. They present this shift as natural, almost unavoidable. When everything shares the same space for long enough, difference emerges not as rebellion, but as response. Pressure grows quietly, without sound, without urgency. It is not felt as danger yet. There is no fear, no desire to escape. But the stillness that once felt complete now feels attentive, as if the world is leaning forward, waiting for something it cannot yet name. This is the moment before purpose exists. And that matters. Because purpose implies direction, chosen by will. Pressure implies change born from condition. One demands control, the other creates it accidentally. The earliest layers of the story suggest that the world does not move because someone wanted it to. It moves because holding everything together forever is impossible. Balance, when held too tightly, becomes strain. The water still holds, but it holds differently. The closeness that once felt natural begins to feel heavy, not unbearable, but noticeable. The kind of heaviness that does not hurt, but makes movement feel inevitable. This is why the tablets do not rush forward. They linger here, in the moment before separation, because this is where the nature of power is decided, not by decree, but by condition. If change comes from pressure, then power does not originate in authority. It originates in response. And response does not belong to anyone. It belongs to the system itself. This idea is subtle, but it reshapes everything that follows. Because once change begins without command, command becomes a reaction, not a cause. Authority appears as an answer to movement, not the reason for it. The world, sensing its own imbalance, prepares without knowing it, not through planning, but through tension. Shapes press closer, space feels tighter, the deep remains, but it no longer feels endless in the same way. This is the last moment where unity remains untouched. The tablets treat it as fragile, not because it is weak, but because it is about to transform into something that cannot return. Once difference is felt, even faintly, sameness can never fully restore itself. Pressure does not destroy unity. It ends innocence. And with that ending, the conditions for separation quietly assemble themselves, not through force, not through desire, but through the simple truth that nothing can remain perfectly still forever. The world does not break here, it prepares. The separation does not arrive with violence. There is no clash, no sound of struggle, no victory or loss. The tablets are careful here, almost restrained, as if raising their voice would misunderstand what is happening. What changes the world is not force, it is release. For a long time, heaven and earth have existed together, pressed into the same space. Not fighting, not resisting, simply sharing a closeness that once felt natural. But pressure, once formed, cannot be held indefinitely. And when release finally comes, it does not ask permission. The tablets do not describe a command ordering the sky to rise or the land to fall. No voice speaks authority into existence. Instead, the world responds to its own strain. Heaven lifts, earth settles, space appears where none existed before, and in that moment, distance is born. This is not triumph, it is relief. The pressure that once pressed equally in all directions suddenly has somewhere to go. Air rushes into the newly opened space, sharp and alive. For the first time, there is above and below. For the first time, movement becomes possible. The world inhales. Humans feel it before they understand it. Their bodies react instinctively, bending, breathing deeply, as if something heavy has been lifted from their shoulders. Not because they were crushed before, but because they had never known space. The Anunnaki are present here, but they are not the cause of this moment. They do not pull the sky upward. They do not push the earth down. They witness the release, moving within it rather than creating it. And this detail matters, because if separation is not commanded, then it is not owned. It belongs to the world itself, and what belongs to the world cannot be fully controlled by those who arrive afterward. The tablets describe shock, not celebration. The world feels larger, but also exposed. Where closeness once protected everything equally, distance now creates variation. Light reaches some places before others. Sound travels farther. Shadows appear for the first time, not as threats, but as consequences of space. With distance comes direction. With direction comes position. Nothing has claimed authority yet, but the conditions for authority have quietly arrived. Space allows influence to travel. It allows voices to carry. It allows presence to be seen from far away. And this is how power first learns how to move. Not through dominance, but through openness. The separation solves the pressure, but it introduces a new problem. A world with space is no longer held together automatically. Balance must now be maintained, and maintenance invites roles. The sky remains above, the earth remains below. Between them, something new begins to form. A middle space where movement gathers, where presence feels stronger, where influence becomes possible without force. The Anunnaki understand this instinctively. They step into the open space not as conquerors, but as figures who know how to stand within distance. Their voices carry farther now. Their gestures reach wider, not because they demand attention, but because space allows it. The tablets do not praise or condemn this. They observe it. Power has not yet chosen what it will be. It is learning where it can stand. Humans watch these tall figures moving easily in the open space, and something subtle shifts in their perception. Height begins to matter. Position begins to suggest meaning. Not because anyone says so, but because distance teaches comparison. This is the quiet birth of hierarchy, not through law, not through violence, through space. The world, once held by closeness, must now learn how to hold itself differently. Structures will follow, rules will appear, but they have not arrived yet. For now, the change is physical, not political. Heaven and earth no longer touch, and that separation will never fully close again. The tablets linger on this moment because everything that follows depends on it. Once distance exists, influence becomes possible. Once influence exists, authority will eventually claim it. But for now, the world simply adjusts, breathing in the space it has never known. After the separation, the world does not become calm. It becomes open. And openness changes the nature of everything: how sound travels, how light falls, how presence feels from a distance. A world with distance invites direction, and direction invites someone to stand closer to it than others. At first, nothing is declared. No one announces themselves as ruler. No voice claims ownership of the new space between heaven and earth. But the tablets suggest that roles begin to form the way patterns form in water, quietly, through repetition, through gravity, through where things naturally gather. Power emerges as position before it emerges as law. Some figures begin to stay closer to the open space above, where voices carry farthest and where height makes presence impossible to ignore. Others remain nearer to the deep and hidden layers below, where stability is held not by command but by systems that do not need to be seen. And so, almost without warning, two different ways of holding the world begin to take shape. Not as enemies yet. As approaches, one path is built on structure, the other on balance. The tablets, in their careful way, give us two archetypes that will repeat endlessly in human history. Enlil and Enki. Enlil belongs to the open space. He is associated with air, with height, with distance that allows authority to spread. He stands where the world is visible and where being seen becomes its own form of power. In a world newly separated, clarity feels like safety. Rules feel like protection. Structure feels like relief after uncertainty. Enlil does not need to shout to be obeyed, because the space itself helps him. His presence can be felt from far away. His silence can be interpreted. His words carry, and interpretation is powerful. Because where there is distance, there will always be gaps in understanding. Those gaps will be filled by belief, by fear, by comfort, by the desire for certainty. Enlil's path offers that certainty. It organizes, it assigns, it names. It tells humans where to stand and how to move inside the new world. It divides space into roles, and roles into duties, and duties into identity. It makes life predictable, and predictability feels like peace. But another form of power exists in the tablets, and it does not stand above. It does not seek visibility. It does not depend on belief. It holds the world from beneath. Enki belongs to the deep layers, the hidden flows that keep land fertile and stable, the waters that cool, nourish, and carry pressure without noise. His presence is not a spectacle. It is a system. Enki's power does not travel through commands. It travels through stability. Water arrives when it is needed. Ground holds when weight presses. Rivers continue to flow. Humans may not see Enki often, and that is the point. They feel his work before they understand it, in harvests that grow, in land that does not crack, in the quiet steadiness that keeps life possible while louder forces shape the surface. The tablets imply something unsettling here. The most important forces in the world do not always ask to be noticed. Enki does not build authority by demanding attention. He holds balance by listening to pressure. He adjusts flow. He releases tension. He moves with the world rather than forcing it to remain still. And because of that, his power does not need agreement to function. Water does not require belief to move. Stability does not require worship to hold. This creates a contrast so sharp it almost feels like a warning. One path is visible, one is hidden. One creates certainty through structure. One creates survival through flexibility. One insists on stillness. One allows movement. And in the beginning, both seem necessary. After separation, humans crave order. They want to know what changed and why. They want reassurance that the world will not collapse again into closeness and pressure. Enlil's structure gives them language and rules, a way to exist without constantly feeling uncertainty. But the world is still alive, still shifting, still adjusting to the new distance. And if structure grows too rigid, it presses against the natural flow of balance. It blocks release. It turns movement into disobedience. Enki senses this long before any conflict appears, because balance does not wait for ideology. It responds to pressure. The tablets do not frame this as morality. They do not tell us that one is good and one is evil. They show that both paths carry weight, and that weight will eventually shape the world. A world held only by order becomes tight. A world held only by flow becomes uncertain. Humans stand between them, learning for the first time that survival is not only about being protected from danger, but about aligning with whatever truly holds the world together. And slowly, almost invisibly, attention begins to rise upward, toward the visible, toward the structured, toward the voices that claim certainty, while the hidden systems continue to work beneath their feet, unpraised, unnoticed, holding everything steady. And that imbalance of attention will matter more than anyone realizes. Because what is watched grows larger, and what is ignored becomes vulnerably, if it carries the greatest weight. As attention shifts upward, the world begins to feel organized for the first time. Paths become predictable. Movements repeat. Words settle into patterns that no longer feel new. What began as guidance slowly becomes expectation. Order spreads quietly, not through force, but through comfort. In a world that has already changed once in a way no one controlled, certainty feels like safety. Rules reduce the weight of choice. Structure removes the need to constantly watch the ground beneath your feet. When roles are clear, doubt has fewer places to hide, so people follow. At first, it feels natural, not imposed, not heavy. The rules do not arrive as chains. They arrive as reassurance. They tell people where to stand, when to speak, how to move through the open space without fear of stepping into the unknown. And because the structure works, it grows. Enlil does not need to demand obedience. The system itself does the work. Repetition turns guidance into habit. Habit turns habit into identity. Soon, the order no longer feels like something external. It feels like the way the world simply is. This is the most powerful stage of control, when no one remembers choosing it. The tablets describe this transition carefully. There is no moment of collapse, no open resistance. Life continues. Crops grow, shelters stand, the world functions, and because it functions, questions begin to fade. Why this rule? Why this role? Why this structure? Those questions feel unnecessary now. Everything seems stable, and stability feels like truth. But something subtle begins to shift beneath the surface. Obedience continues, but belief starts to thin. Not all at once, not loudly. It thins the way breath shortens under constant pressure. People still follow the rules. They still repeat the words. They still move through the structure exactly as expected. But inside, something loosens. The certainty that once made the order feel protective now feels rehearsed. This is not rebellion. Rebellion requires energy, anger, desire to confront. What the tablets describe here is quieter than that. It is hesitation. A pause before action. A second of doubt that no one voices because voicing it would require believing it matters. And yet, it does. Because systems built on certainty rely on belief to move quickly. When belief weakens, everything slows. Commands arrive, but their effect lags. Instructions are followed, but without conviction. The structure remains standing, but its rhythm falters. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. From the inside, the world feels slightly out of step. This is the danger of order that has forgotten balance. It assumes compliance is enough. It listens for noise, for rebellion, for disruption. It does not listen for silence, and silence is where belief leaves first. The tablets never accuse the system of cruelty. They do not portray Enlil as a tyrant. They show something more unsettling. A structure that works so well it no longer needs to ask why it exists. Rules multiply to maintain clarity. Expectations harden to preserve predictability. Flexibility becomes risk. And risk feels dangerous in a world that remembers pressure too well. But while order tightens above, something else begins to respond below. Not in opposition, in correction. The deep systems do not argue. They do not protest. They adjust. Pressure builds where flow is blocked. Weight gathers where movement is restricted. Balance does what it has always done. It responds to condition. Enki senses this long before anyone names it. The waters change their paths. The ground holds tension differently. Release is delayed in some places and forced in others. These changes are not dramatic. They are quiet signals, easy to ignore until they accumulate. Humans begin to feel them as discomfort, a sense that something is being held too tightly, that life requires more effort than before, that following the rules no longer guarantees ease. Still, most people do not question the structure. They question themselves. Maybe they are doing it wrong. Maybe they need to try harder. Maybe certainty will return if they follow more carefully. And this is how order maintains itself even as belief drains away. Because doubt, turned inward, becomes compliance. But balance does not turn inward. Balance presses outward. And as the system above grows more rigid, the world beneath grows less forgiving. Pressure has limits. Flow has thresholds. And when release is delayed too long, it does not disappear, it waits, and the waiting grows heavy. Resistance does not announce itself. It does not arrive with anger or slogans or raised voices. The tablets describe it as something far more unsettling than rebellion. They describe discomfort, a feeling that settles into the body before it reaches the mind, steps slow without intention. Hands pause before completing familiar motions. Eyes linger a little longer on the ground than on the structures above. Nothing is being challenged openly. And yet, the world is no longer responding in the same way. This is how balance resists control, not by opposing it, but by refusing to move on its terms. When flow is constrained too tightly, it does not stop. It searches, it presses, it reroutes. The deep waters sense pressure long before language forms around it. Enki does not issue warnings. He does not confront the order above. He listens. And listening, in a system built on control, becomes a form of resistance. Water begins to behave differently. Paths that once carried weight easily now strain. Currents slow where speed was expected. Release comes late. Then suddenly, in places where structure assumed stability, the ground responds as well. Not with collapse, but with fatigue. Cracks appear not as disasters, but as signs. The world is adjusting itself because it must. Humans feel this shift without words. They follow the rules, but the rules no longer feel aligned with the world beneath their feet. The effort required to maintain normal life increases. Small failures accumulate. Repairs take longer. Systems feel tight, overworked, stretched. And still, there is no uprising. That is the danger. Order is prepared for conflict. It knows how to respond to open defiance. It tightens rules. It sharpens clarity. It repeats commands more often, believing repetition will restore certainty. But repetition without belief is only noise. The structure above listens for sound. Balance below speaks in silence. This is where control begins to weaken, not visibly, but structurally. The system depends on smooth movement, on quick response, on belief carrying instructions effortlessly through space. When belief thins, friction appears everywhere. Tasks that once took moments now require effort. People comply, but without energy. The world continues, but its rhythm is uneven. Enlil senses the instability, but not its source. From above, it looks like hesitation, inefficiency, a need for clearer rules. So the structure tightens further. More clarity, less flexibility, stronger boundaries. But tightening does not restore balance. It increases pressure. And pressure always finds a way out. Enki understands this. He does not push against the system. He allows the deep mechanisms to respond naturally. Water surges where flow was denied. Land shifts where weight gathered too long. These movements are not violent. They are corrective. They remind the world that stillness is not stability. Humans begin to notice something important. The ground responds faster than commands. The water answers sooner than rules. When faced with uncertainty, listening to the land feels more reliable than listening to authority. This realization does not spread as an idea. It spreads as instinct. People stop waiting for permission to adapt. They adjust quietly. They move when the world moves. They pause when it tightens. Survival begins to feel less about obedience and more about attention. And attention shifts. Away from symbols, away from height, toward sensation, toward what feels real. This is the moment when control loses its greatest advantage. Not power, not structure, but trust. Trust does not leave loudly, it drifts. And once it drifts far enough, authority must either bend or break. The tablets show this without drama. They describe a system straining against reality itself. Order demands stillness. Reality demands movement. And between them, pressure grows too heavy for silence to carry alone. Something will have to change, not because anyone chooses it, because the world no longer supports what is being held in place. Balance has waited long enough. When the release finally comes, it does not feel like an ending. It feels like an exhale. The tablets do not describe fire or punishment or collapse. They describe movement. Pressure leaves where it can no longer be held. Paths open. Weight redistributes itself. The world reshapes quietly, unevenly, without asking who is ready. Some structures fall, others remain. Not because one side won, but because reality adjusted to what it could still support. Those who endure do not do so through strength or authority. They endure through attention. They notice when the ground shifts. They listen when flow changes. They move with the release instead of standing against it. This is the pattern the tablets leave behind. Not victory, not defeat, continuation. Life goes on, altered but alive. Water finds new roots. Land settles into a different balance. The world does not return to its original stillness, but it does not collapse into chaos either. It becomes something else shaped by what it learned when pressure was allowed to speak. The figures who once stood at the center do not disappear. They simply no longer hold the same position. Authority that depended on certainty feels quieter now. Balance that worked unseen feels closer, more personal, more trusted. Humans walk carefully through this changed landscape. They touch stone. They listen to rivers. They learn again how to read signs instead of commands. No one announces a new beginning, because beginnings do not require permission. They arrive when survival continues. And this is where the story gently loosens its grip, because the tablets were never trying to tell us what to believe. They were recording a pattern, a cycle that repeats whenever control grows too rigid and balance is ignored, whenever certainty feels safer than listening, whenever pressure is held too long. Long after the Anunnaki become names in stories, long after systems rise and fall, the same moment returns again and again, in worlds, in societies, in lives. When silence grows heavy, when flow slows, when holding on begins to hurt more than letting go. The choice does not announce itself. It never has. It waits quietly, the same way it always has, asking without words whether this time you will listen earlier. The world feels quieter now, not because nothing happened, but because what needed to move has already moved. And in that quiet, the story does not end. It rests.